Professor Sampson is the Henry Ford Professor of Social Science at Harvard University. He's director of the Social Science Program at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. He's the president-elect of the American Society of Criminology. He just finished a term as chairman of the Harvard Sociology Department. He's the scientific director of the Project for Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. Professor Sampson completed his undergraduate work in sociology at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and his graduate work at the State University of New York in Albany. He taught at the University of Illinois and the University of Chicago before coming to Harvard. He's been the Senior Research Fellow of the American Bar Foundation, a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the National Academy of Science, and among his many awards, has received the Stockholm Prize in Criminology in 2011. He will be talking about the subject of his forthcoming book, Great American City, which summarizes and consolidates the research that is transforming many of the social science disciplines today. So please help me welcome Professor Sampson.
Thank you, Peter. That was a very generous introduction. Pleasure to be here tonight. A lot of faces in the room. I see, I think, a lot of students. How many here are undergraduates? Okay, great, terrific. How many grew up in a city? How many grew up outside Pennsylvania? Okay, good. Got a diverse audience tonight. So what I'd like to do, and I hope you've had some caffeine. It's always tough to talk after lunch or after dinner, but I'm going to press the limits a little bit here and talk with you about some research that I've been working on along with colleagues for the last, well, too many years, 15 years or so, on a large-scale project about the city, about neighborhood effects. And I have a forthcoming book, and what I thought I'd do is to walk you through some of the findings, and I'm trying to keep it at the level of key ideas and describing the data and the relationship between the data and those ideas. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, at least in my opinion, on a lot of stuff. Maybe you'll think it's a little bit too much detail. I'm going to keep it at the level mainly of pictures and images, and I'm a deep believer in maps and images. I was trained, actually, that if you can't see something, it's probably not worth a lot. Now, that's not totally true all the time, but I think there's some wisdom to that. So what I'd like to do is walk you through an overview, and I'd like to leave time for questions, so any and all questions are welcome. I apologize because I'm going to try to go through a fair amount of material. You might even consider it a rampage of sorts through material, but I think it gives you an idea, a feel, even if we don't get into detail on a lot of stuff. So I'm going to begin at the beginning. I'm going to be a little bit formal here at the beginning, and then I'm going to work through some of the actual findings. So, if you will, imagine a world where distance has died, where globalization and high-tech wonders have rendered place irrelevant, where the internet, BlackBerries, planes are the coin of a global realm, not local difference. From the north end of Boston to the North Beach of San Francisco, imagine cities where neighborhood differentiation is an anachronism, a victim of what many have called placelessness. On the surface, this thought experiment matches our common experience. Who doesn't know someone wired to everything but a cell phone, plugged into an iPod, or perhaps even tweeting walking down the street? As for the idyllic urban village said to characterize communities of yesteryear, few of us have the time or energy for dinners with our neighbor anymore. Americans are notoriously individualistic and roam widely. So what then is the relevance of place? Globalization is everywhere triumphant according to the dominant narrative in the social sciences. rendering us elsewhere rather than placed. Thus, according to the social theorist Anthony Giddens, we need not imagine at all, for the very essence of high modernity in contemporary conditions can be captured in the idea of place as phantasmagoric. I love that characterization, phantasmagoric. Neither does the public intellectual Thomas Friedman, you've probably read some of his work, think that we need a thought experiment, because of course for him the world is already flat, or at least flattening. Now these influential thinkers and common wisdom about the effects of technology are right at some fundamental level. Universal forces create places that are similar no matter where we go. The strip malls that line cities and suburbs across the country come quickly to my mind, uniformly ugly in the same way no matter where they alight. Even cities as a whole are thought by many to be interchangeable. If we can be somewhere, anywhere, then nowhere in particular stands out. And if we cannot be anywhere, literally speaking, we can still be elsewhere, aided by profound advances in technology. Some of you probably even do that in class or here. We all do it. Now, setting aside the suspicion that only the privileged elite enjoy a global playing field, there are also good empirical reasons to take seriously the question of place and concepts like neighborhood or community. Social network theorists, who you may have come across in your classes, have shown us that urbanites create networks that cross-cut non-spatial communities. You might not know your neighbors on an intimate basis, but you're quite likely to build viable sets of relations across the city, state, country, even the world. In an influential paper in the 1970s, the sociologist Barry Wellman referred to this as community liberated, or what you might think of as community without propinquity. With all the emphasis on new forms of alienation from traditional forms of community, it may come as a surprise to you that the intellectual and public concern with the decline of community is long-standing and finds vigor at every historical period. Today's manifestations, I argue, might be unique, but not the perceived problem. Now, in the most abstract version, the theme of declining community and yearning for renewal finds its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? Eden became Sin City, and salvation still awaits. Karl Marx, you've all read Karl Marx, right? Sure you have. Was secular, but the promise of community after the overthrow of capitalism, in his view, was unmistakable and launched societal revolutions. The entire discipline of sociology, in fact, was founded on the upheavals of the late 19th century, widely thought to have frayed the social fabric of Gemeinschaft, or community. The presumed decline of traditional forms of personal association in small towns, besieged by advanced industrialization and urbanization, became the central problematic for key social theorists such as Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, and Simmel. Lewis Wirth, who you may not have read, but was very influential, expanded on these concerns by arguing that population size, density, and ethnic heterogeneity were socially disintegrative features that characterize rapidly changing cities. In fact, Wirth famously argued in 1938 that these defining elements of urbanism made social relations anonymous, like internet surfing perhaps, blog comments on the web, and superficial, like texting, Facebook maybe, with estrangement undermining family life and the bonds of solidarity thought to reflect community. One can read Wirth today, read him from 1938, insert technology as the villain, and get a familiar result. So the classic thesis of decline, aptly described as community loss, thus posits the idea that social ties of modern urbanites have become impersonal, transitory, segmented, hastening the eclipse of local community. Now, the bent went on and just never stopped. The contemporary manifestations of community loss is exposed by the intention focused on the notion of Americans bowling alone. How many have heard that phrase? Bowling alone, right? the decline of American community. Robert Putnam's thesis of a decades-long decline in voluntary associations, trust, informal social control has been very influential. Captured also the attention of the public at large. The concept of community, you've probably read, has also been seen in many debates in the scholarly and public intellectual literature. Social capital, civil society, social movements, communitarianism. More recently came the evidence of a downside of diversity, with evidence pointing to increasing immigration and ethnic heterogeneity as a source of mistrust in one's neighborhood. Now, an interesting irony in all this, I think, is that the placelessness and globalization critique, right, flattening world, technology, we're there, not here, finds an affinity with a long-standing narrative of community lost in the idea that personal ties to the local community have withered away. That's really the key idea. The difference is that the globe-trotting modernist says good riddance, right? Community liberated. That's old-fashioned. Whereas communitarianism can be seen as sort of a resistance movement to counter the bowling alone scenario of decline and inspire a renewal of community. Either way, the implication many public intellectuals and scholarly pundits alike have taken away is that places, especially as instantiated in neighborhoods and community, are dead, impotent, declining, chaotic, irrelevant, or some combination of the above. Okay? That's a dominant theme. I'm going to argue against that. And to do that, I'll now enter Chicago, contemporary Chicago, and yes, global Chicago. Or as Norman Mailer, how many of you read Norman Mailer? Not as many as I thought. Executioner's Song, many other things. You probably didn't read Miami and the Siege of Chicago. But in this book, Mailer, as in a long line of authors, artists, scholars, and even just plain observers of public life have argued that Chicago is the great American city, the quintessential American city. New York is the global city. It's the city of the world that looks out to the world. Chicago is often thought of as the American city, and I think that offers us some advantages. So logic demands then that if neighborhoods do not matter and placelessness reigns, then the city is more or less a random swirl. Anyone or anything could be here just as easily as there. Identities and inequalities by place should be rapidly interchangeable, the durable inequality of a community rare, and neighborhood effects on both individuals and higher level social processes should be weak or non-existent. The effects of spatial proximity should also be weak. And so goes much of contemporary social work. By contrast, the guiding thesis of Great American City, Chicago, and the enduring neighborhood effect is that differentiation by neighborhood is not only everywhere to be seen, but that it has durable properties with cultural and social mechanisms of reproduction and with effects that span a variety of social phenomena, whether it be crime, poverty, child health, protest, leadership networks, civic engagement, foreclosures, teen births, or immigration, collective action, just to name a few subjects I investigate. The city is ordered by a social logic that is spatial in orientation. It is placed, and it yields differences as much today as a century ago. The effect of distance is not just geographical, but social. And that simultaneous social and spatial significance, I argue, is important. Just as Henry Zorbaugh described in his classic The Gold Coast in the Slum in 1929, spatially inscribed social differences constitute an important social phenomenon. And what I'm going to do is talk about a family of neighborhood effects that are pervasive, strong, cross-cutting, and paradoxically stable, even as they are manifest in changing ways. Okay. Enough reading, but I had to give you a feel for the beginning and motivation. And now I want to play that out, because that's an abstract argument in social science about the history of the field. And as Peter noted in the introduction, this is something that scholars have grappled with, the decline of community. It's a big topic. I'm just going to address it in one specific way. Again, with the argument that there's a family of neighborhood effects that cross-cut a number of phenomena. And I want to motivate that by showing you some data and then some results. And I want to tell you the principles first. They're basically a summary of what I just read to you. But I'm going to argue that it's concentration, not placelessness. Secondly, that these go together across diverse social phenomenon. And this is actually something that we don't fully appreciate. The academy is just split up in different ways, not to study social phenomenon necessarily, but demographers study fertility, criminologists study crime, public health people study AIDS, and on and on. The National Institutes of Health are set up in separate silos, but things go together, as I will show you. Therefore, the scientific study demands that we cut across these different ways of thinking. The third is a paradox. I'm going to show you persistence despite change, or what I refer to as the stability of change. Finally, beyond poverty and race. What do I mean by that? Concentration of disadvantage and racial segregation are crucially important, but we need to push beyond that and understand the mechanisms by which that transmits influences on our social life. A focus on structural and cultural mechanisms, and I'll give you a concrete feel for that. Okay, let's start with violence. This is Chicago. I don't think I have a pointer. Maybe I do. See if I have one. Lake Michigan is on the right, if you didn't know that already. Yeah. So this would be Lake Michigan over here. Many of you have been up here. That's O'Hare Airport. You spend many hours there, no doubt, delayed. And what this shows you is a simple differentiation across the city of homicide, the death of an individual typically committed by another young male, of a male, and child health. Babies that are born low birth weight, less than 2,500 grams, and infant mortality combined into low, medium, and high. So the gray areas are areas that have high child health. The white areas are where babies are dying at birth. They have low birth weight. And what you see is that the violence rates, which are the stars, proportional to the number of homicides, and by the way, there were 3,298 homicides in just 5 years in Chicago. These things go together. Violence and child health are related, and I'm going to show you later, or at least allude to findings that exposure to violence among women is important and actually has effects on kids later in their life. Incarceration. It's not just the commission of violence, but the response of the criminal justice system is highly placed. This is the rate of incarceration per 100,000, and you'll see a tremendous difference. In fact, in these areas up here, this entire swath of the city, very few people are being taken out and sent to prison. In some cases, almost none, whereas in certain segments of the community, particularly these two clusters, almost, in this case, about 4,000 on average per 100,000 are being sent to prison. So, you've probably heard, or there's people that talk about mass incarceration. Actually, it's not mass incarceration. Mass incarceration implies that there's a large proportion of all populations being incarcerated. That's not true. It's the local concentration of mass incarceration. Okay, you might think that's just the bad stuff, crime, incarceration. Well, what about what I call local cosmopolitans? What about what the economist Richard Florida has called the creative class, or others are referred to as bohemians? So these are designers, artists, actors, producers, directors, dancers, choreographers. Maybe some of you in your future have that. Guess what? They are very much spatially concentrated. in these areas with a large circle. And moreover, remember we talked about, or I asked you to think about placelessness and technology. Those people most likely to use the internet are spatially clustered. These gray areas, people are on the internet more than 5 hours a week. And in fact, other research that I've not done shows that the more people are wired into high tech, the more likely they are, when given the opportunity, to be involved in the community. So a lot of what we think we know is wrong. Even internet use is concentrated spatially. That is, I mean, you may be connecting to the world, but people are still concentrated. Okay, point 2. I've demonstrated, at least, can't show you everything, but let's assume that we've shown that there's concentration of phenomena. Second is the paradox of persistence. So you've heard that there's a lot of change in neighborhoods, and it's true. And you've heard about gentrification, neighborhoods changing. The era of the 1990s was an era of tremendous change in United States cities and a lot of gentrification. But the fact of the matter is that there is a relative stability of the position of neighborhoods. And I want to get this across. I'm not saying there's no change. Think about the pecking order in your family, brother, sister, rich, poor. The pecking order is as follows. If you were high in poverty, in this case concentration of disadvantage in 1990, then in 2000 you are also high. If you were low or an affluent neighborhood, you are also affluent, even though you may have improved or gone down as a neighborhood. Only one outlier here. In social science, this is pretty much close to a perfect relationship. By the way, Chicago is not unique. Almost for fun, this is every single neighborhood in the United States. So wherever you live is represented here. Okay? I know, it seems kind of crazy. But it's true. There's 64,902 what we call census tracts, which are small areas of about 4,000 or 5,000 people. And what we did is we have the data on the poverty rate and the concentrated disadvantage in all of them. The relationship is 0.9 in both Chicago and the rest of the U.S. So Chicago is not necessarily unique. Okay, back to incarceration. Incarceration is persistent. In fact, I was shocked. I thought there was a mistake in the data. The relationship is 0.98 between the incarceration rate in 1990-95 all the way to 2000 to 2005, basically a 10-year gap. Almost no change. Moreover, it's a persistence of a black-white gap. This is a scatter plot with the communities named in Chicago, and these are areas that are African American, and these are areas that are predominantly white. The highest rate incarcerated community, that is the incarceration rate in a white community, is down here. East Garfield Park is up here. That is a differential of 40. Okay. Now, oftentimes in social science, we talk about differentials of 2 to 3 to 4 as being big. 40 is like way off the charts, right? There's something profound going on. And again, it's persistent inequality. All right, so you say, well, okay, we just had the recession. Been a massive change in the world order, so things must have changed. So what I did here is to look at what's happening from 2000 until 2009 of the latest data. This is based on housing data and people receiving subsidies. Again, a very strong relationship. In fact, some communities are even getting poorer. The poor are getting poorer at the community level. Different way to phrase this is that the recession doesn't overturn the pecking order. How many study crime? How many take criminology classes here? Okay, what do you know about crime? What's happened in the last, it's on the slide, but don't look. What's happened in the last 10 years or so? Anyone? What's happening at the crime rate? Come on, it's going down. You know that. So if it's going down, that should change the relative structure of neighborhood crime rates. Here's the overall secular decline. Paradox. See if you can figure out how this can happen. This is the relationship between the violence rate 1995 to 2000 and the violence rate last year, 2010. Okay, long period of time, straight line. What is going on? Pecking order remains. If you're a high crime rate community, you remain high crime rate, but your crime rate goes down. Okay? If you're a low rate crime community, it goes down, but things are not switching. It's an important distinction. Stability of change. All right. Enough motivation. You get the feel, the picture of things. So I'm going to tell you now about a research project that delves. It's going to get a little bit more complicated in terms of some of the findings, but I promise you, I don't think I'm going to show you any numbers in the sense of, no tables, no equations, but I don't in the book either, by the way, and that is because I'm a believer that you can, first of all, show even complicated analyses in ways that are intuitive, and that's important. And what's also important, and we were talking about this, some of us at dinner earlier, is that a key part of this project is an emphasis on the design of a project. So I'm not here to tell you that the statistical analysis is the answer. It's important, but it's not the answer. The design of the project, and this is a collaborative project with many people, set out to study context in and develop. Development, in other words, in the context of neighborhoods. It's not easy to do, but what we did is to carry out two studies in one. The first is a multi-method longitudinal study of neighborhoods. You're going to learn about this tonight. And what we did is we went to Chicago and we assessed the neighborhoods as an independent study, important in and of itself. That is, individuals are important, but they're not the only thing. In fact, in a radical interpretation, they're not the most important thing. I know that doesn't go well with our way of thinking, but I actually believe that. Secondly, we took these neighborhoods and we surveyed the residents. You live in a neighborhood. We went around, sampled, and asked people about the neighborhood. Secondly, and you'll see more about this, we observed the neighborhood. Thirdly, we asked about the organizations and the leaders in the neighborhood. Churches, businesses, the cops, you name it. Census data, health data, a bunch of other data. I'm not going to get into details. And secondly, what you might think of as a suite of longitudinal studies. We started with kids that are very young. In fact, we started, how can someone be age 0? Well, we enrolled women when they were pregnant. So the idea was to get a birth cohort, and therefore to study kids at the very beginning of their life and follow them. And then we also looked at 3-year-olds, 6, 9, 12, 15, and 18. They were followed each for about 7 years. Okay, this is a little technical, but I'm going to do it anyway because the design, again, is important. This is Chicago. What I want you to get a feel for is that we sampled neighborhoods such that we have a great diversity. We have black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods, mixed neighborhoods, low income, middle income, high income. This is not a study of poverty. This is not a study of just blacks or just whites. We have high income black communities, lower income white communities, sampled purposely to disentangle the various aspects. And then within each neighborhood, we sampled the families. Okay, then we followed them up. This represents, it's a simple map, but it represents about 8 years of work carried out by about 200 people and actually millions of dollars. Again, this is a multi-group study. And what this shows is each dot is a person in the study that started out, and this is where they ended up at the end of the study. Now, you can't quite tell, but it's part of the finding, is that the yellow areas are the outlines of Chicago. And this is the metropolitan area. This is Wisconsin. This is Illinois. This is Indiana. This is Gary, Indiana over here. And the only yellow that you can see is basically areas that you can't live. This is O'Hare. So people live there for a couple days during a snowstorm, maybe. But you cannot live there technically, and that's why there's no dots there. And this is an industrial area down in the Lake Calumet area, which is non-residential. Every single community in Chicago is covered. People moved. In fact, 43%, think about that. Just about half the sample moved, often multiple times. They cover the entire area. They cover the south suburbs, west, north. And some are in Philly, Well, no, not really. Western, let's see, what's down there? I don't know what that is. You've got a New Jersey, New York component here. These dots are where people moved anywhere in the country and beyond. You have Mexico down here. You have California, Los Angeles, San Francisco. And what's interesting, by the way, just as an aside, you note this. It's sort of return migration in a bit. Down the Mississippi, we have return flows to Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. Pretty common, actually. And New York, New Jersey, and a lot around. So what's happening is we have this spread out in the country. We follow these people wherever they lived. We collected data on every neighborhood that they were in at any year in their life. Okay, so think about it as a moving data collection where we have the context and we have the person. All right, now I gave you the general principles starting out. Now I'm going to get into some specific concepts. One, which I'll talk about, is a social mechanism that has been described as collective efficacy, and it really has two components. One, it's about the collective aspect of a community, that is, whether a community is relatively cohesive or not in terms of whether people are trusting one another. And secondly, efficacy, which has to do with shared expectations for action, specifically for social control. And it turns out that people vary tremendously in terms of their mutual engagement with respect to social control. So if you ask people, for example, if there was a kid hanging out in the street corner, spray painting graffiti or skipping school, would anybody do something about it? You could engage the kids, you could call the school, you could call the police, anything. Some people say it's not my problem. Other people engage. There's a big difference in the collective efficacy of residents. I'll show you a little bit about how that relates to various phenomena. Second, I'm going to talk with you a little bit about social disorder. How many of you have heard about the broken windows thesis? Yes, good. Good criminology teaching here. Villanova folks, Allison and others, yes. James Q. Wilson, George Kelling, arguing that, well, what's the argument? Cues of disorder, what? Lead to more crime, unraveling of a neighborhood. I'm going to tell you a little bit how we studied that and some nuances to that. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about organizations and the importance of organizations for civic society. A key theme of the book is selection bias as a neighborhood effect. And you say, what does that mean? Well, I put it in blue because I'm not going to really talk about it. So I'll spare you. Your pain is going to be reduced. Trust me. But you can read about it if you would like to be tortured a bit. And I'm finally going to talk about higher order structures, which that also sounds pretty intimidating. But it's actually pretty intuitive, and I'll try to describe a little bit what that means. And I'm going to try to do this all in about 20 minutes or so we have time for questions. Again, the idea is this is the 30,000 foot view rather than drilling down too much. So how do we do this? Well, another theme, and sorry for one more piece of jargon, I guess, but sometimes concepts are important, language is important. And the idea of ecometrics is actually pretty simple. It's the notion that we've spent a lot of time in the social sciences developing measurements and metrics for the study of individual differences, like IQ tests. All of you probably had to take some kind of a standardized test like the SAT? Yeah. You know how much research goes into the SAT? Educational testing service, people spend millions of dollars. There's been research for 100 years on how to measure, well, we call it IQ. There's a whole debate about what that means. But the point is, we do this all the time. But we don't have a standardized metric for how we look at context. And so the notion here is we need a metric for the study of ecology, hence ecometrics. And we did that through the study of residents in the community survey, systematic social observation, and the projects that I'll talk about. Okay, now I'm going to walk through those four concepts and then summarize. So the idea of collective efficacy is that it's a social mechanism that helps us understand how and why the various social features of communities that we know are related to crime and well-being, such as the concentration of disadvantage, how that comes about. And basically, the argument is that resource advantages residential instability, that is where neighborhoods are turning over or are unstable, are related to violence and disorder, but in part because they affect the network tie. So for example, where a neighborhood is unstable or people are fearful or there's high levels of disadvantage and there may be organizations that are not as connected as they are in well-resourced neighborhoods. Through this process, there is direct relationship in terms of resources and violence and disorder, but there is what we call in social sciences an indirect or mediating pathway whereby communities have their collective efficacy eroded over time, and therefore people feel less empowered to take action, and in many cases are in fact taking less action. And that is related to crime. That is, where there's higher collective efficacy, there's lower crime. And there's a reverse relationship where violence can undermine collective efficacy. And to give you a feel for what it looks like very simply, for example, I've already showed you that crime has gone down. This is violence, homicide rate per 100,000. This is 1995. This is 2002. The gray bars are those neighborhoods that are in the lowest quartile, 25% and below. Just think about quartiles, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you're in the lowest quartile, the rate of violence is about 17 per 100,000. And by the way, this is adjusting for, this is important, adjusting for poverty, stability, population density, friend ties, prior homicide, moral cynicism, I'll talk about in a minute, and the hatched or checkerboard type bar here is collective efficacy in the highest quartile. And what you see is differentials that are quite substantial and significant. Percentage differences of 30% and more, where the rates of violence, in this case homicide, are significantly, substantially lower in high collective efficacy neighborhoods. And this is independent of poverty. So what this is saying is that even a poor neighborhood can achieve violence reduction through collective efficacy. At the same time, poverty is also undermining communities and having an effect by increasing violence. So what's happening is both forces are working, but there's an independent relationship, we think, and that's important to study. Moreover, it affects change. And this is probably going to be a little dense, but the intuitive point I'd like you to take away is that changes in poverty and changes in collective efficacy affect the rate of change in a community. And the reason this is important is by looking at that kind of change, we can take into account a lot of the characteristics of the community that are different between communities that we can't even get at in our models. In other words, it may be, or like individuals, like you are different than the person sitting next to you, and we may never be able to measure that, but if we follow both of you over time, those stable differences can be taken into account. And the bottom line is, this red line is showing neighborhoods where there were increases in collective efficacy and decreases in poverty, and you see a substantial drop in the homicide rate compared to the blue line, which is declines in collective efficacy and increases in poverty. And by comparing the magnitudes in the different lines, and I do that in the book, I'm not going to do that here, what you see is that there's independent effects. Again, it's not that poverty is unimportant. That's not the storyline here. The storyline is that these two things are working together, and they're different mechanisms, and they have different implications for intervention. But the point is, the decline in the homicide rate, which I showed you early, we know crime is going down, but the rate differs. This is almost flat, right? It's not declining as much, and look at the difference here. Change and stability are differentially related to neighborhood characteristics. Finally, with regard to collective efficacy, I want you to also bear in mind that the neighbors of a neighborhood matter. And what I mean by that is, you saw those different neighborhoods in the Chicago map. It's not just about what happens within a given neighborhood. If you're proximate to a high crime neighborhood, that has a bearing on you. And even the neighborhood 2 or 3 neighborhoods away matters. And this shows this. I describe this in the book more, where spatial proximity, for example, these bars are those neighborhoods that are proximate to neighborhoods high in violence. The gray areas are proximate to low homicide. And these two are low collective efficacy and high collective efficacy. And if you stared at this for a while, you would see and be able to intuit that what's happening here is that collective efficacy going down means lower violence, is related to lower violence, but it's not enough, right? That even if you have collective efficacy, or even if you're in a, let's say, an advantaged neighborhood, that proximity still matters. Okay. I'm just going to move on here because there's research that shows that this is not just about Chicago. This was a study I published and I follow up on it. It shows that Stockholm, how many of you have been to Stockholm, Sweden? A few, good, yes. Stockholm's a lot different, right? How is it different? Different society, welfare state, more prosperous in many respects. The violence rate is much lower. This is Stockholm right here. Every neighborhood in Stockholm, we were able to collect data and carry out the same survey. And guess what? The crime rate goes down as collective efficacy goes down. And here's Chicago. So there's an interesting thing going on here. There's a neighborhood effect, but there's also a society effect. Or think of this as a Stockholm effect. Every single neighborhood in Chicago is higher than Stockholm. What does that mean? Violence is higher in Chicago. Collective efficacy doesn't account for the difference between societies, but there is a parallel in the neighborhood level mechanism. It's an interesting finding, we think, because what it suggests is a different culture, there is no racial segregation in the way that there is in the United States. There is no concentration of poverty like there is in the United States, yet we see a similar mechanism. I'm going to skip over two more findings on Boston, and I want to just tell you that it's not even just about collective beliefs in the sense of shared expectations for action. It's also behavioral. And I was motivated to study behavioral differences. Economists, I know there's some economists here, always have a good point. They say, well, what do people do? Not just what do they say, but what do they do? So I thought, well, what's a good indicator of other regarding behavior and collective indication of the collective nature of a community that's behavioral in orientation? Came up with two things, which I think are kind of interesting. One is, if you have a heart attack on the street, you hope that somebody gives you CPR, right? I mean, it sounds a little odd, but I mean, if no one gives you CPR, you're likely to die. And guess what? And I didn't actually believe this would be that strong. The CPR rate varies across communities. And we got these data from another study that had emergency rate response data in Chicago in the late 1980s, 1988. And we controlled for hospitals, age of victim, race of victim, sex of victim, where it took place. And it turns out that the rate of giving CPR varies tremendously, with the darker areas having a higher rate of CPR return. Secondly, we carried out what's known as a lost letter drop study. 10-second version, we took envelopes with letters in them, fictitious letters, one to an employer, one to, "Dear Jane, I'm looking forward to visiting you this weekend, please pick me up," blah, blah, blah. And we stamped them, and then we went around the neighborhoods and we randomly threw them on the sidewalk, in the street, in the park. And we coded when we threw them down, whether it was raining, whether it was windy, how hot it was, and we threw thousands of them. Now, why should you pick up a letter and mail it back? I'll leave you to think about that. But the fact is that the rate of return varied. Substantively, the rate of return varied, in fact, from 0% return in some neighborhoods, to 82%. People picked them up, put them in the mailbox, and they were mailed to another city. And we coded that, and I know this is a little cheeky, but these envelopes here, the larger the envelope, the higher the rate of return. It varies by community. And I argue that there's a cultural character to neighborhoods because the CPR rate is related to the return rate of letters 12 years or more later. Now, obviously, giving CPR doesn't cause you 12 years later to return a letter. That's silly. But what's not silly is the idea that there's a cultural and social character to these contexts that influences the behavior of people. And finally, the legal and moral cynicism of a community, which is also related in a way to a cultural concept where people, in fact, you might even think of it as moral cynicism. I know that sounds a little, out there perhaps, but when people say, yeah, laws were meant to be broken, in a sense that's a moral claim, right? Or it's okay, there's no right and wrongs. If I can get away with it, I'll do it. Well, that and the fact that the people believing the police can be trusted or the police are fair varies across neighborhoods. So partly what I'm arguing in the book is that culture and collective beliefs are something that social scientists have not done so well. We've tended to neglect it. There's an emphasis on structure, and I'm trying to bring it together and argue that there's three components to this that are all related to the notion of community well-being. Now, this is a more theoretical summary of the concepts, and I'm not going to get into it anymore. But the point is that collective efficacy, altruism, or social altruism, and this is really a story about social norms, I think. Social norms that vary by context matter. Ask yourself the question, would you rather live in a community where people gave you CPR if you had a heart attack, or where if you dropped your letter or lost your purse, right, even if you had no money in it, would it be returned? And I think the answer is you'd want to live in the community where it's higher. And this relates to the notion of a certain social norm, but also the notion, and I get into it with regard to the legal bit, of social justice and norms of what I call the good community in a Rawlsian way, if I can refer to that. How many of you have read John Rawls' Theory of Justice? Okay, good. So the notion of the good, and actually, just for one person here maybe, the veil of ignorance, right? What is the veil of ignorance?
It's been a couple years. I don't know. If I'm remembering correctly, it's something about not knowing the laws that well.
Or not knowing what the future will bring. His argument is that if we sort of had the original condition where you didn't know if you were going to be rich or poor, then setting the sort of the laws or the standards. And part of thinking about the good community is what would people want, not knowing their outcome. And we can think that through, and I do in the book, in terms of aspects of well-being. So there's a bit of philosophy in it, but I won't give you any more philosophy. So let me talk now, and I promised you I'd try to get through this, leave time for questions. I want to talk a little bit about social disorder, and then a little bit about organizations and networks, and then that'll be it. I love this stuff because, well, I guess I've always felt like what you can see in a community is really important, and how you interpret what you see is really important. I mentioned systematic social observation. This is a picture in Chicago of a gas disconnected sign, boarded up windows. That tells you something. So what we did is to code and observe neighborhoods throughout the city through what we called systematic social observation. And basically what we did is well, this is 1995 now, when we started. And what we did is we rented an SUV, I don't remember the model, but it was an SUV with tinted windows and mounted two video moving cameras in the back. And videotaped, drove about 3 miles an hour down the street, videotaped both sides of the street, 2 videographers, and then we had one person speaking into a microphone if there was, in recording anything that was happening off screen, like, oh, there's an accident, there's a drug bust around the corner, or whatever. And then we had 2 observers who coded on sheets various aspects of traffic and housing conditions. Now, the beauty of this is that through the videos, you can then go back to the videos, slow them down, stop them, still photos, and you can code, and you can see things like this. You can see there's garbage on the street. There's broken windows. Remember? Killing, broken windows. There's graffiti. We coded gang graffiti, or what we call tagging graffiti, which is, Johnny Loves Mary, that kind of stuff. Political graffiti. Daily is expletive deleted. That kind of stuff. And you can really get a good sense of what's going on. And the question I want to pose to you is the following. This is a real picture. Actually, this picture is in the book. I actually took this picture. It's not from 1995. This is from 2010. Is this graffiti? Yes? Yeah. Why is it graffiti? This kind of looks like it, right? I mean, you've got garbage can here, stuff sprawled on. This looks like it might be gang graffiti. How many would say this is something else? Yeah? What is it? Art. I couldn't draw this. That looks pretty sophisticated. So you see, right, sitting next to each other, disagreement. Same picture, same place. This is good because in a sense, in a picture, I can tell you the motivation and the meaning of this whole analysis. And that is, what is the social meaning of this? The error that Kelling and Wilson made was not that cues are important. They're fundamentally important. The error is in assuming that the meaning is invariant across people and across neighborhood. So there's multiple things going on. Cues are centrally important, but the perceptions and the collective perceptions are crucial in interpreting it. It is related to lower or higher crime, health, migration. These are question marks. We systematically assess that. And basically the model that I put forth, along with Stephen Raudenbush, a colleague, and it started out in a paper in 1990, I forget what it was, 1999 or 2000, and followed up, and then in the book with longitudinal data, is fairly straightforward. Let me just walk you through it briefly. It's the notion that seeing disorder or interpreting disorder is a function of multiple things. One is your own position and your individual level history, your exposure. For example, if you had been exposed or you grew up in neighborhoods where there's lots of, let's say, graffiti or garbage, maybe it was a poor neighborhood. You may have a different norm, like what's it, it's not a problem, or it is a problem. There's the actual disorder, but we can measure that because we drove down the streets and we can actually, at a very high degree of accuracy, we can measure the amount of disorder. But it also turns out, and this goes into research, and I'm not going to get into it from social psychology and in other areas on implicit bias, and the notion is that we subconsciously make very quick decisions, right? That's why it's implicit. That our evaluation of a context with respect to, in this case, disorder, is influenced by the people that we see on the street. So the argument here is that the concentration of minority groups and immigrant groups, unfortunately, conjures up, especially in a society where there's rank inequality and a history of inequality and urban change, that links the concentration of immigrant and minority groups to neighborhood decline. If that's the narrative, then people are going to implicitly stigmatize places and shared meanings, and that will have an effect on their evaluation of the importance of disorder. So the argument, to rend it down into a very simple example, would be if there's a bunch of kids hanging out in the corner, or there's that graffiti, whether or not you think that's a problem is going to depend in part on the context in which it occurs, whether the kids are black or white, for example, or whether that scene that I just showed you, that picture, the neighborhood that's in is going to make a difference in whether you think it's a problem or not. And that's a very different model. It's not saying that cues are unimportant. It's saying that the social meaning is important. And we showed that this link is very powerful. There's a strong relationship between the concentration of minority groups and immigration and perceived disorder. And the irony is, particularly with immigration, is that the data show that immigration is related to lower violence. Okay, I'm going to skip over this to get to one last point on disorder. We call this cognitive inequality. The socially perceived disorder at one point in time actually predicts the future trajectory of a community in terms of its poverty rate. So the perceived disorder is leading to decline, and it predicts it even more so than the poverty rate of the community. Okay, I'm going to end with another argument, and that is organizations and networks matter. I've talked about collective efficacy. I've talked about perceptions of disorder. Now I want to up it to the notion of a network and the notion of an organization. And two concepts. One is the connectivity among leaders or institutions in an area, and the second is civic engagement. And I know there's a lot here, we were talking about this earlier, a lot of you at Villanova, activity-based learning, engagement in the community. It's actually relevant because what we find is that there's a lot of variability in collective engagement across communities. And what's important is organizations. And of course, Villanova is an organization, so there's an interesting link here, and I'll show you a little bit about the variability in collective civic action. Very briefly on the data, there's a study called what we call KeyNet Chicago, and it's a study that started in 1995, went to 2002, high response rate. You don't need to read all the details, but what I do want you to see is that these are the institutions or the kinds of people that we studied. And it's important because this really runs across the spectrum of education, police, religion, law enforcement, political, community organizations. And in the collective participation study, we also looked at collective civic engagement events, things like marches for justice, or communities that want to improve their schools, so they have fundraisers to build a new library. These are things for the good, right, where people are trying to engage with others, so more than two people getting together, and also the density of organizational life from our community survey. And we actually collected data through the National Center for Charitable Statistics and geocoded it, so we have every nonprofit organization in the community and the density of that. Okay, so we put that all together and a few pictures on the results. On networks, this is what it looks like at the individual level. These are all the key leaders in Chicago. Some of you may guess who that is. Can't tell you, confidentiality, but let your mind roam if you know Chicago. And what you'll see is there's lots of little cliques, and the size and color have to do with the extent to which that person is receiving lots of contacts and ties from other important people. And these the yellow people out here, tiny yellow people, I think there's a song, the little yellow people. These are isolates. Think about that. You're a community organization director. You are the principal of a school, and yet you have no contact with any other organization that I just showed you. That's an important fact. In fact, the isolation is maybe the most important fact. That's at the individual level. And now we can look at things like the ties between community organizations, politics, law, education, and business. And it turns out that these are very differential. And that, in fact, some of the most important institutions in our society, particularly education and law enforcement, I know a lot of you are interested in law enforcement, and also schooling, are very disconnected. In fact, education mostly in law should be more connected to education, I think. It's mainly only connected to politics, which is a little depressing. I go into further what that means in the book. But the point is that the politicians and the politics are connected to the community organizations, but there's a lot of interdomain work that needs to be done that is simply not represented, that is more isolate. And furthermore, that picture of all those individuals, when you look at it by community, this is what it looks like. And there's huge variability, and that's really the bottom line, is that these are just two communities I've selected out just to give you a feel. The community on the left is actually a real community called South Shore, but you don't need to know where that is, particularly in Chicago. What you need to know, or what you can see, is that all these red dots here, instead of yellow, they're red here. Those are isolates. Those are people that have no connections. And what do you see here? One fairly large clique and a couple small ones, that's it. Now, what would it be like to organize in that community? What would it be like to get something done? It would probably be different than this community where there's only 3 isolates and every single person in this web is interconnected. In fact, densely interconnected. That difference, which you can see, can be empirically measured in a straightforward way with network analysis, and we can statistically do this, and we did. Cohesiveness, centralization, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but the point is we can extract from this network such that we can say that there are differences across communities and they are stable. This is the line over 7 or 8 years that shows that communities, despite turnover now, because these are constantly changing, people are moving in and out of positions, yet the network character is the same or very similar despite that turnover. And what it leads to, when I said the higher order structure, is something that looks like this. This is now the entire city. And rather than focusing in on a particular neighborhood, this way of thinking now takes the entire structure of the city and looks at the relationships among communities. So if you are interested in getting something done, and you can think about it locally, you're at Villanova, and maybe you're in activity-based learning, and you want to do something about the local community. You want to do something in West Philadelphia or some other action of Philadelphia. It's not enough to just think about that community. You have to actually connect to other communities. And what you can see is that it's a mistake to think about neighborhood or neighborhood effects only as the characteristic within a circle. The reason is there's differential ties across all these different communities, and some communities are connectors and some are not. And when we look at this and its relationship to various outcomes, what we see is that it makes a difference. And I'm not going to go into all the details. I'm just going to, I wanted you to just to see, in a sense, how you might conceive of the notion of a network that goes beyond the neighborhood. It's not that neighborhoods don't matter. It's that those connections, in addition to the neighborhood characteristics, matter. And the last thing is that the collective action also matters. Remember I said we measured collective activity, people trying to get things done. This is an example of a rally. I took this picture. This is from Operation Ceasefire in Chicago. When I came across this intersection, I was wondering what these guys were doing. They're all in orange shirts. They've got signs. They're protesting. They're holding up traffic. A little bit, well, this was pre-Occupy, whatever, Occupy Boston. But, it's collective action. That's collective action. I drove up and I asked what was going on. It turns out, some of you may have heard this on the news, but if you followed Chicago at all, but it made national news in 2010. There was a beating outside Fenger High School in the south side of Chicago where a broad daylight, about noon, a student, innocent, just was walking out of the school and was beaten with a wooden plank with about 100 people surrounding him, watching kind of a gang fight. And it made national headlines. And it was a block away. And these men, and they were all men, African-American men, were protesting the lack of attention that the rest of the city, and this was several months later, had paid to that violence. They were trying to change the norm in that community. They were really taking action to try to stem violence. That's an example of collective action. And what we found is that it can make a difference, but more than that, why is it that these kinds of activities occur in some places and not others? And the crucial link here is the density of nonprofit organizations. And if you go back and think about that earlier model I put up, what the theory is trying to do is to put together characteristics of the neighborhood in terms of the people, the collective efficacy, the network ties, but also, and importantly, in terms of organizations. And so we found some other things. Sorry, I'm not going to show any more of the tables, but I just wanted to show you that this is an example of what I'm saying. These linked hands, these are where there's higher collective action, and where there's a darker gray area, that's denser organizations. There's a strong relationship. And by the way, it's not the same thing as individual civic action, because these little check marks, this is voting. It's not the same thing. Where people are more likely to vote, that's an individual act. I'm not saying it's unimportant. Please Don't not vote. You didn't hear me say that. I'm saying that voting, crucially important, but it's not the same thing as collective civic engagement. And I think that's a point that's been missed in the whole debate over social capital decline. And what we show is that organizations matter and collective action matters, and it's not the same thing. So I'm going to skip over that and just tell you that I think there's a couple implications here for those of you interested and for social science interested in place-based or community interventions. First of all, and to summarize, I've gone over the importance of social mechanisms, things like collective efficacy, cynicism about the law. I've gone over, or at least given you a glimpse of findings that say the perceptions of disorder, our cues about those, whether it's art or whether it's graffiti, whether and how we interpret that makes a great deal of difference. The contextual cognition in terms of whether a neighborhood is going to decline or improve. And to change the meaning, by the way, that's a direct implication, means that we can have an effect in a way different than the broken windows theory. I've argued that organizational, or what I call in the book, the organizational imperative. Given the changes in society, organizations are increasingly important, and in terms of building civic society, we cannot overlook them. I've argued that there's a pivotal role for leadership networks. Some of you will be leaders someday. Yes, you will. This is, an elite place in the sense that you are the education and you are the future. And it's important to bear in mind, it's not just about your own performance. It's about the connectivity that you and or the organization make to other organizations. And the nature of that makes a difference. I didn't talk about selection and choice, but it's important in the reproduction of poverty, I argued in the book. And I'm saying we need to go beyond the local community. It's not just the local community you live in, there's spatial dynamics, and there's this higher order structure, and it matters for how we evaluate what's going on. So in a way, the book is, at the theoretical level, it's bringing together this notion of selection, neighborhood composition, and this idea of spatial dynamics and higher order structures. The way to think about it is that the neighborhood effects, in a way, are this mediating middle ground between what's going on in society, right? Globalization, I started out, I was reading about the vast changes that are taking over society. But they're lived on the ground, right? They're mediated through place and where we live. And it's not that individuals aren't important. You all have choice. And our choices change the neighborhood, but our choices are independently, or cannot be independently conceived because they are, in fact, being influenced by that very context. So, if you all have a lot of energy and want to read, or maybe if you need a doorstop, because it comes in at over 500 pages, but I think it's readable. This is all forthcoming probably next month from the University of Chicago Press. And as I said, there's actually not one table in the entire book, but there's a lot of pictures like you saw. So anyway, thanks. I went a few minutes over, but I wanted to give you the big picture of how to think about the neighborhood effect in contemporary society. Thank you. So happy to take any and all questions. Or I'll ask you some. Anything? Yeah.
When you did the test for the CPR,
Yeah.
did you find any relationship between like the race of the person giving CPR and the person receiving it?
Yeah. So good. Did everybody hear that? Was there a relationship between the race, I think, or sex of the person? It turned out that there was an age difference and there was an initial race difference where blacks were less likely to be given CPR, and that, however, did not hold up once we took into account the age and the sex of the victim. So once you took that into account, it actually didn't have a direct effect. But there were age effects, as you might expect. And as I recall, I don't think there were any gender effects. But the differences you saw, and it's a good question, the differences that you saw adjusted for whether or not there was differential composition of the victim. So the idea is to really measure the propensity to engage in CPR or other regarding behavior, independent of whether or not the person that's on the street is of a particular ethnicity, particular race or not. Because again, if you think about going back to the notion of Rawls, if you think about the good society and the veil of ignorance, right? If people are only giving CPR to people that look like them, then that's probably not the society we want to live in. Because in the long run, individuals, you could be ending up in the community not like yourself, right? So from the veil of ignorance perspective, we would want to work against that sort of result. Anything else? How many, by the way, I just had a question. Oh, I was going to ask how many are involved in activity-based learning or are involved with a community-based organization. Anyone? Okay, you got a few, so maybe you have some pointers or some questions you can ask your leader. Yeah, question.
I just had a question on the first chart, which was the infant birth weight and homicide.
Yeah.
Did you find the main correlation between that was drug use, or like among in those communities that like higher drug use leads to lower birth weight, and then also homicide?
So if we were to put up the rate of drug use is the question in relationship to that, particularly not so much if you were to put up marijuana use or powder cocaine use, the differences aren't quite the same, but in terms of, and depending on the historical era, crack or heroin use do vary significantly by community. And you're right that, and in fact alcohol abuse too, are related. What's interesting about that chart though, and I didn't get into the details, is that relationship between violence and low infant health, that was poverty adjusted, so some of the other correlates like drug use, as you're pointing out, are important, but they don't take away that relationship. And I think that one of the things that's going on here is that, again, things go together, and what does that mean? It means not that one is necessarily causing the other, because infant mortality we wouldn't think necessarily causes violence, although there is evidence to believe that violence may be related to low birth weight through mechanisms of both social support and stress. And that's the big one, where women that are living in neighborhoods where there's lots of stress because of high violence are more likely to, the babies come to term earlier. So there may be that, but I think perhaps the bigger issue is really thinking about the conditions and the resources that communities have that lead to basically a whole set of social problems and social conditions that make it harder for people to live. And so there's higher stress, there's higher levels of disorder, and what I really, if you're to take anything away from this, is that to try to extract one of these things, or even to intervene in only one, is really misleading because it's not taking account of the entire process. And so we really need to think about changing in a holistic manner neighborhoods, but also in families, right? And this is a philosophy of social science that has to do with families, right? Because if we can use the term dysfunctional families, it's often not one thing, right? It's often many things. And I don't consider these communities dysfunctional so much as beset by a number of problems, and the solutions range from macro level, state level policies to smaller policies, and they have to be holistic. And again, if I can refer to a conversation that you weren't at, but we were talking about an intervention that tries to do that earlier today, and that's called the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, and it's an intervention that tries to change the school. It tries to change services to kids. It tries to change safety in the neighborhood. And their belief is that kids live in this holistic context, right? It's not just the school, it's not just the family, it's not just social services. And that's a really tough one because we don't like to think like that. We like to think, okay, the solution to education is a teacher intervention. The solution to crime is the police. The solution to AIDS is, and you can go on and on and on. And that's not completely false, but it probably also won't eradicate the kinds of issues we have to deal with. Any others? Yeah.
In one of your last slides, you said going beyond the local community.
Yeah.
Do you mind elaborating on that?
Sure. I know I didn't have as much time to get into that as I would have liked. So when we typically think about neighborhood characteristics or community characteristics, we think about, and social scientists, including me, often measure them with regard to the characteristics within that local community that has it's bounded, right? So you live in a neighborhood, however you want to define it. Let's call Villanova here a community, a residential community. And presumably there's dorms on campus. I don't know, do you have to live on campus all the way through or no? Freshmen have to live on campus? Okay, so that's your residential community, right? It's defined geographically. What I mean by beyond local community is that there's characteristics of the Villanova community that you can measure and assess, number of college students, their characteristics, their income, and so forth. But there's the world outside of Villanova, right next door, right? The next neighborhood over and the neighborhood beyond that. And what I'm arguing is that neighborhoods themselves are nested, they're connected. And if I can go back to, I take a bit, that in a way is saying the beyond community is that if I were to only show you this community here, I'm running out of juice here, let's say that Westtown community up there, I could tell you that that community is characterized by any number of characteristics, but that doesn't have anything to do with all those lines, connections or not, between that community, because that's not a characteristic of the community. Those lines or those networks are a characteristic of the relationship between that community and all the other communities. Does everybody get that difference? That is, in a sense, a fundamental idea of social network analysis. It's not my idea. That's a social, it's really a sociological insight that goes back 40, 50 years, depending on how you want to count it. The innovation here, I would argue, is applying it to the neighborhood level. That is, the relationships, the relations, the connections are not just between people. They are between people, but the connections between people instantiate and create these differential levels. So what I'm arguing is that the characteristics of the community, poverty, collective efficacy, are important, but they're not enough because they're embedded in this larger structure. And so we have to take this larger structure into account. And that's the idea of beyond local community. Yeah?
You had mentioned on the web with the relationship between politics and law,
Yeah.
religion, but I was wondering if you found anything about like prevalence of places of worship and social cohesion in neighborhoods?
Yeah, good question. You go into this for a while. So it depends on what dimension we're looking at, but, pardon?
Maybe repeat the question.
Yeah, so it's a relationship between places of worship, so really the dimension of religion and its connection with other domains, right? So, make a long story short, first of all, churches don't just do religion. Now that may sound obvious, but it's actually really important and is often overlooked. And what we found is that some ministers are deeply involved in things like housing development. For example, some churches, to go unnamed, large churches in the south side of Chicago are involved with community development corporations. And the gentrification and mixed income housing are in essence deeply tied with the church. So in a sense, the religion, right, which is supposedly non-secular, or the theological dimension, in fact, a theological dimension is used, because we're supposed to do good, to improve local housing. But what happens when you try to improve local housing? Well, then you got to deal with developers. You have to deal with politicians. And one of the criticisms is that then this leads to a very non-religious kind of strategic decision-making. And it does appear to have implications for how the residents feel about religion. And I'm not going to make a causal argument here, but let me just tell you one fact, and there's a chart in the book that shows that the areas with the highest density of churches, and this is even within the black community now, because the white and black communities differ greatly in the density of churches, with black communities tending to have a higher density of churches. But there's a very strong relationship between the density of churches in a community and trust among those in the community. And the relationship is negative, very strongly negative. It looks like this. And what do I mean? The more the churches, the more density of churches, the more people mistrust their neighbors. Call it, in God we mistrust man, question mark. But there's a theological reason for that. What would it be? Maybe. There's two competing hypotheses. One is the hypothesis of the fact that churches are, in many cases, doing business, and they're sort of viewed like politicians, right? A lot of people don't trust politicians because they're viewed as not having their interests at heart, and so on and so forth. But what would be the theological reason for lower trust? Human beings are inherently what? Well, first of all, religion, particularly in the African American community, is not about this world, right? So I mean, it's really about the other world. So in a sense, man and human beings are inherently fallible and can't, and not be trusted. And it's really about the other world. So there's actually theological reason for expecting that there would be that relationship. But the fact that it's so strong and it holds up is pretty interesting. It has implications for whether or not the church is the correct organizational unit. So if you think about it, it has a lot of implications for collective action, whether it's the most appropriate unit for organization in the community. And I'm actually writing a paper with a colleague on this now because if you think about the civil rights movement, the church was really the driving force between a lot of the collective civic action. And that appears to have declined over time, in part because of the changing nature of the church. And in the white community, first of all, the density is lower, and there's really not a lot of trust there either. It's just not as steep. So the religion is a really interesting connection, and we're trying to probe that more. Yeah, one more?
You said that you showed this web, and you said that there were people that isolate themselves on the individual level from the community.
Right.
And they happen to be like principals and directors of companies, schools.
Right.
So I don't think you mentioned reasons why they isolate themselves from the community. So in your opinion, what are some of those reasons?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would rephrase it slightly when you say isolate themselves. They are isolates, but I didn't really tell you why, and I don't have a full answer because, in part, the objective of the analysis was to look at the consequences at the structural level for that configuration across communities. But it's an important question in the sense of why it is, because it may be that some leaders feel like they don't need it. There's less of a need to have that sort of connection. In other communities, there may be, first of all, and I didn't show you this, but in some, and it goes to this too, that if you were in one of these communities, it may be that you don't have any ties, you're an isolate, because that wasn't really about the ties with others in your community. But it may be that you have ties with, let's say, City Hall. You have a connection with a developer or someone in another community that may override that local community structure, right? So you may be an isolate within your community, but a connector across. And I wasn't able to get into the full set of findings here, but what we did look at that in the sense of looking at the extent to which the density of ties in the community is different than, and it is the answer, the extent to which a community is I'll use the term broker, right? I mean, you know what a broker is, not a financial broker, but rather a broker is somebody who's mediating relationships. So, if you want to pass something to someone several people down, information or a tie, and it's mediated by the person in the middle, that just means that your tie cannot be understood absent that broker, that person who is making that connection. So in answer to your question, some isolates appear to be isolates in their communities, but have connections elsewhere. And we look at that, and the answer turns out to be that I don't want to get too technical here, but the betweenness or the between community ties are a different phenomenon, and they have different relationships. And I go into that further in the book. At the individual level, that's an important question too, but I don't deal with that in the book in terms of like why you and not the person next to you is connected into community. I'll look at the implications of that fact.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.